What if the war in Europe could have ended months earlier, before the forests swallowed whole divisions, before the Ardennes turned into a frozen slaughterhouse, before tens of thousands of telegrams reached American homes? Because in the years after the shooting stopped, captured German commanders didn't blame some unstoppable Allied machine. They blamed a choice, a decision made while their front was cracking, their fuel was gone, their units were dissolving into frightened fragments, and the road ahead felt wide open. Stay with me, because this isn't just a what if. It's the kind of question that makes every grave between autumn and spring feel like it came from a meeting room. And if you're watching on WW2 Frontline Shadow, you already know the kind of stories we chase here, the moments where history turns on a single judgment call. So if you want more WW2 stories told with suspense and clarity, hit like right now and subscribe within this first minute, so you don't miss the next one. Because what you're about to hear isn't a myth. It's what Germany's top commanders said after they had nothing left to gain by flattering anyone. In the year 1946, British historian Basil Henry Liddell Hart sat across from captured German officers and asked a simple question. What would have beaten you faster? He expected something technical, logistics, air power, industrial capacity, the kind of answer you can measure with graphs and tonnage. But he didn't get a technical reply. He got an indictment, quiet, sharp, and personal. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Germany's senior commander in the West, looked at Hart and described something he said the Allies had handed Germany in the early autumn of 1944. Time, a strategic gift. Not because German genius created it, but because Allied decisions allowed it. And the longer Hart listened, the more it sounded less like a critique of maps, and more like a confession that the guns could have fallen silent far earlier. 6 months earlier, some claimed. Maybe not on the exact day, maybe not with a parade down every boulevard, but early enough that tens of thousands of men might never have died. To understand why that claim hit so hard, you have to go back to late summer of 1944, when Germany's army in France wasn't retreating in neat lines. It was disintegrating. The catastrophe in Normandy had shattered formations that were supposed to be the backbone of the Western Front. Roads were littered with destroyed equipment, tanks, artillery pieces, transport vehicles, abandoned not because the men didn't want to fight, but because they couldn't move, couldn't refuel, couldn't organize. Whole units were torn open and scattered like paper in a storm. Hitler sent Field Marshal Walter Model to take charge, his so-called troubleshooter, the man dispatched to stabilize chaos. But what Model found made even him uneasy. He wasn't handed a clean defensive line. He found fragments, soldiers without weapons, officers without men, units that existed only as names on reports. The front was something you could draw with a pencil, not something you could defend with steel. At that moment, Model's usable armored strength was painfully thin, roughly around 100 operational tanks in some assessments, with many more broken down or starving for fuel. Meanwhile, the Allies had multiple armored divisions capable of driving like a hammer, if that hammer was aimed and supplied. And where would that hammer land? Toward Germany's industrial heartland, the Ruhr, where the war machine was forged. The terrifying part, from the German perspective, was how exposed it felt. If the Allies struck with concentrated force, Model had very little that could reliably stop it. For weeks in September of 1944, Germany was hanging by a thread. Allied intelligence could see cracks. Frontline soldiers could feel it. Patton's Third Army could smell the end of the war in the air, like rain before a storm. After months of fighting since D-Day, this was the first time some Americans dared to believe the finish line was real. You can imagine the talk in mess lines and around maps. Maybe we're home by Thanksgiving. The speed across France felt like flight. Not walking, not crawling, flying. But while the troops saw an enemy collapsing, something else was happening far behind them. Something colder, quieter, and in many ways more powerful than German machine guns. The brakes were being applied, not on the road, but at headquarters desks, where fuel allocations and political promises carried more weight than the front's momentum. Patton reached the Moselle River, the last major barrier before the main German defensive system the Allies called the Siegfried Line. His forward elements were within reach of the German border. In his mind, and in the minds of many around him, the route to the Rhine looked open, and beyond the Rhine, the heart of Germany itself. His intelligence officer, Oskar Koch, kept sending assessments that sounded almost unbelievable in their confidence. German forces were finished. One hard, concentrated push could crack them before they recovered. Model, on the other side, was doing what desperate commanders do when the world is collapsing. He was scraping together anything that could hold a rifle. Older men from reserve formations, teenagers pulled from youth organizations, clerks and rear area troops who had never fired a weapon at an enemy in real combat. He was trying to build a wall out of weak bricks, praying the other side wouldn't hit it with full force. And each day the Allies delayed gave him exactly what he needed most: time. Every sunrise was a gift. Every week was a miracle. Because the longer the Allies hesitated, the stronger Model could become. Then came a date that mattered like a turning key. On September 1st, 1944, Dwight D. Eisenhower assumed direct command of Allied ground forces. And with that authority came a decision that would shape the way the war ended. Not whether the Allies would win, by then victory felt inevitable, but how soon and at what cost. There were two approaches on the table. One was brutal in its clarity. Concentrate everything on one main thrust. Choose the best commander for the job. Give him priority in fuel, ammunition, transport, and air support. Let him drive. It was high risk, high reward. If it worked, the war might end quickly. If it failed, you could lose momentum, suffer a serious setback, and hand the enemy a chance to counter. The other approach was safer politically and more balanced on paper. Advance on multiple fronts at once. Push everywhere. Squeeze Germany from several directions. Spread the risk. Keep the coalition satisfied. Keep everyone moving, even if no one moved as fast as they could. Patton wanted concentration. Many Americans leaned toward aggressive focus, and German defenses, in that vulnerable window, looked too weak to withstand a truly concentrated strike. But Eisenhower wasn't just commanding armies. He was managing an alliance, two nations with pride, politics, and competing visions of who would be remembered as the one who broke Germany. Bernard Montgomery wanted priority in the north. Churchill pressed Roosevelt for a larger British role. Montgomery, never shy about leverage, signaled he would go over Eisenhower's head to Churchill if he didn't get what he wanted. And a political rupture in the alliance was a danger Eisenhower could not accept. Not after years of building cooperation that held the Western Front together. Then there was Patton himself. Brilliant, aggressive, effective, yet politically radioactive. The slapping incidents had stained him in the public eye, giving him supreme operational authority at that moment would have detonated controversy back in Washington. Eisenhower understood something that German generals later admitted they had studied closely. The Allied war effort was not just about tanks and divisions. It was also about public opinion and coalition unity. And looming over all of it was logistics, the invisible chain that decided how fast steel could move. The Allies captured Antwerp on September 4th, 1944, one of Europe's great ports. On a map, it looked like the solution to the supply crisis. But reality came with a catch. German forces still controlled the Scheldt estuary leading to the port. Until that waterway was cleared, Antwerp was essentially useless. Supplies still had to come from the Normandy beaches over long, strained routes. Clearing the Scheldt was assigned largely to Montgomery's area, but Montgomery's attention shifted elsewhere. He was focused on a dramatic plan, one that promised speed and glory, and perhaps the kind of headline that would define reputations. Eisenhower chose the broad front, not because he couldn't read the map, not because he didn't understand the opportunity. He chose it because he understood the politics. It was the tax he paid to keep the coalition from splitting at the exact moment it needed unity most. But on the ground, the effect was immediate and brutal. Patton's Third Army began to slow in the first week of September, not because German fire stopped them, but because empty fuel tanks did. The Allied supply system was straining past its limits. Trucks from the Red Ball Express and other routes couldn't push enough fuel fast enough from the beaches to the spearheads. Every army group demanded more than the pipeline could deliver. And when Eisenhower had to decide who received priority, he leaned toward Montgomery's plan. Montgomery had convinced Eisenhower to support Operation Market Garden, an audacious airborne assault meant to seize bridges across the Rhine in the Netherlands. Montgomery promised it would end the war by Christmas. It sounded like a shortcut to the finish line. Fuel, ammunition, transport aircraft, and air support were committed. American airborne divisions were placed under British command. The operation became the center of gravity for Allied attention. Patton, watching his own momentum die, was furious. To him, it felt like the Allies were giving Germany the one thing it needed most: time. He warned that halting his advance would allow the enemy to rebuild. He begged for fuel. He argued that the window was closing, and he believed that if the Allies wasted it, they would pay in blood later. Market Garden began on September 17, 1944. It was the largest airborne operation in history. And it failed. The plan collided with reality. Unexpected German formations, fierce resistance, bridges that did not fall into Allied hands as hoped, and a British airborne division cut off around Arnhem. Of roughly 10,000 men dropped into that fight, only a fraction escaped. Many were killed. Many were captured. Total Allied casualties climbed into devastating numbers, well beyond what anyone had sold to the politicians and the public as the quick ending. And as the survivors struggled back, the tragedy wasn't only the loss in the woods and towns of the Netherlands. It was also the fuel that had been burned and diverted, the momentum that had been bet on a shortcut that led to a dead end. The time that had been handed to Germany while Allied spearheads sat still, waiting. Patton had predicted the risk. He had warned what stopping would mean. But the decision had been made. Walter Model, watching all this from the German side, could hardly believe his luck. In the early days of September, he had almost nothing. A broken army, no stable line, no reserves worth naming. He had reported upward that the situation was hopeless without reinforcements. Then something happened that felt unreal. The Allied advance slowed. In some places, it stopped. The concentrated thrust he feared never came. So Model worked like a man racing a clock he could finally hear. He pulled units from quieter sectors. He activated reserve formations inside Germany. He conscripted workers and handed them rifles. He rebuilt defensive positions that had been weak or unmanned. Slowly, The West Wall, the line the Allies called the Siegfried Line, came back to life. By late September, Germany had a line. By October, it had reserves. And by November, it had something even more dangerous: plans for a counteroffensive. The Allies had given Model roughly 6 weeks. 6 weeks to turn wreckage into resistance. 6 weeks that, according to later German testimony, should never have existed. And then the war dragged forward, through autumn, into winter, into forests and mud, and freezing nights that wrote themselves into history as slow, grinding horror. After Germany surrendered in May of 1945, the interrogations began. German commanders sat in captivity and answered questions. And it was in these rooms that Liddell Hart collected statements that sounded, in effect, like a verdict on Allied choices. He compared interviews. He cross-referenced accounts. And from that pattern, one idea surfaced again and again. Many German generals believed the Allied Supreme Command had missed a great chance to end the war in the autumn of 1944. Rundstedt was direct about what he thought the Allies should have done. Concentrate a really strong striking force. Break through past Aachen into the Ruhr area. In his view, Germany's strength was in the north. Control northern Germany, and you control Germany itself. Coupled with Allied air domination, he argued, such a breakthrough would have ripped apart the weak German front and forced collapse. Others echoed the theme in different words. Some called it a gift. Some said the broad front was fundamentally wrong. And some were even blunter. The backbone of German resistance had been broken, and they were waiting for the Allies to notice. That last idea is chilling, because it suggests something hard to accept: that the enemy believed they were beaten, and that only Allied hesitation kept them alive long enough to bite again. Then came the obvious follow-up question, one that turns this whole debate into something personal. If a concentrated thrust was the answer, who should have led it? The German officers weren't arguing for Montgomery. They found him methodical, predictable. They could often anticipate his next move and prepare. Bradley was competent, they admitted, but cautious, careful in a way that could be read and countered. But when the conversation turned to Patton, the tone shifted. Patton represented speed, aggression, armored thrusts, relentless pressure, the American way that German commanders feared most, because it denied them time to think, time to rebuild, time to recover. Some recalled remarks, suggesting Patton was the best opponent they faced, the type of commander who would have exploited that September weakness until it broke completely. And yet Patton was the one-man coalition politics could not fully empower at that moment. He was too controversial, too volatile for public promotion, too risky to place above allies who demanded equal stature. So the autumn window closed, and what followed looked, to German officers later, like unnecessary suffering. The fighting that came after September did not feel like a victory sprint. It felt like a slow, costly grind. The Hürtgen Forest became one of the darkest examples. Months of brutal combat in dense woodland, for ground that some argued could have been bypassed. Casualties piled up into staggering totals. Young men froze in foxholes, fought yard by yard, and died for terrain that might not have mattered if the enemy had been broken earlier. And as the Allies battered their way into Germany's defenses, they faced the Siegfried Line not as a weak, unmanned shell, but as a revived obstacle. The very thing that had been vulnerable in September now demanded blood to cross. Then came the moment that, more than anything, made the German gift of time argument feel hauntingly real. On December 16, 1944, Germany launched its last major offensive through the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge. The attack achieved surprise and early success. One reason, German officers later noted, was that Allied positions were thin. The broad front approach had left fewer reserves concentrated where they were needed. Germany punched through the weak seam, and for a time, the situation looked dangerously uncertain. American losses were terrible. Tens of thousands of casualties in a matter of weeks, with thousands killed. Entire units were overwhelmed and forced into desperate survival. It was the kind of battle that burns itself into national memory. And German commanders admitted something, even more unsettling. They believed that offensive was only possible because they had been given time in autumn to rebuild and prepare. In other words, the 6 weeks mattered. The delay mattered. The choice mattered. This is where the story turns into something more than a debate between historians. Because every day that the coalition argued over priorities, young soldiers paid for the compromise. Every time resources were split, Germany gained time. Every time one commander fought another for fuel or credit, the enemy breathed. Some German officers even observed that the Allies seemed to fight 2 wars at once, one against Germany and one within their own alliance. Germany only had to survive the second long enough to rebuild for the first. But this is also where the story demands honesty. Historians still argue about whether a single concentrated thrust would truly have ended the war in 1944. Supply lines were stretched. Ports were not fully usable. A fast spearhead could have outrun its logistics and become vulnerable. There were real risks, real unknowns, and no one can run history again like an experiment. Yet the German generals who faced the Allied decisions, men like Model, who stared at their own weakness in September, often described that period as the one time they felt truly exposed. They believed the Ruhr was open. They believed the Siegfried Line was not ready. They believed an all-out blow could not have been stopped. And those opinions weren't spoken to win favor. They were spoken when the war was over, when the speaker had already lost. That is why Liddell Hart's interviews hit like a punch, because they suggested a gap between 2 kinds of leadership. Eisenhower did what he had to do to keep the alliance together. That was his job, and he performed it with skill. Without coalition unity, the Western Front could have fractured and prolonged the war even more. But keeping the alliance together is not the same thing as ending the war as fast as possible. Those are 2 different missions, 2 different scorecards, and the difference shows up in the dates carved into headstones. German commanders remembered Eisenhower as the man who beat them, but some also remembered him as the man who allowed them to survive the autumn. And that's the uncomfortable distinction hiding inside this story. The commander who wins a war is not always the commander who ends it fastest. By the end, the German officers who spoke to Hart, Rundstedt, Model's peers, armored commanders, staff men, kept circling back to the same thought. The war could have ended earlier, but political considerations overrode military logic. Whether that conclusion is fully fair or not, whether it oversimplifies the hardest job in the Allied world, it remains one of the most haunting professional judgments ever delivered by a defeated enemy. Because when the people trying to destroy you tell you how you could have destroyed them faster, you have to ask why you didn't. And now that you've heard the argument the Germans made, I want to hear your judgment. Do you think a concentrated push in the autumn of 1944 could really have ended the war sooner? Or would logistics have broken it the moment it crossed into Germany? Was Eisenhower right to prioritize coalition stability, even if it meant a longer road and more blood? Or did politics steal the one window that mattered most? Drop your answer in the comments. Seriously, I read them, and the best debates always happen there. And if you think someone you know would get pulled into this question the way you just did, share this video with them. The more people who argue this out, the more we understand how wars are shaped, not just by bullets, but by decisions. And if you're here on WW2 Frontline Shadow, make sure you're subscribed before you leave, because the next story might make you question another obvious moment in World War II the same way this one does.